Okay, I'm going to share the screen in a minute. I think we've got everybody here. I appreciate you coming into this topic because it is a difficult one, and we're going to go over different aspects of working with sexual trauma victims because having been in this field for a long time, in the 80s, when all of you were probably not even born, um, we began to look at working with sexual trauma victims. We didn't really understand in child welfare that these problems actually existed. I mean, they've been going on since Roman times, but we didn't know. And we figured it out and figured out that we had to do some kind of protocol. We didn't know what we were doing. But that's where some of the stuff that you see lingering around, like say no, get away, tell someone, that old kind of stuff that we all did back in the 80s and 90s that we don't do anymore. The whole, was it a good touch? Was it a bad touch? Was it an uh-oh touch? That was all that stuff that started in the beginning of working with sexual trauma. And eventually, as life went along, we discovered that kids have very complicated reactions to being sexualized. And it's not always clear. And it's one of the reasons that it is extremely hard to prosecute sexual trauma cases, because if you've worked with any children and you're working with them and the perpetrator is not found guilty and the child just can't believe it, it's because nobody believes kids. And children like us remember things differently over time. What you remember of something happening on one day may not be exactly the way you remember it the next day. And unfortunately, prosecutors and defense attorneys are very quick to pick up on that with little children and say, well, they're just not telling the truth. So we're going to look at a lot of that. I want to share the screen, which means you're all going to get very teeny tiny in a minute. All right, can everybody see understanding and responding to sexual behavioral problems? Okay, you got that, good. When I say this is module B, I have so many of these trainings and I mush them together sometimes, depending on, I did this last week at the SCC and I only had an hour. So I took out all the videos and took out some of the slides and kind of made it a half presentation. But in the beginning, when I first developed this training, it was a 4-part training, which is why you see references to module B. And I developed it for childcare staff and some of the group homes who really did not understand what their kids were doing or what they were trying to show them in their behaviors, nor did they know how to respond to it. And I would have to say now, the group of people that I see having the hardest time dealing with the sexual trauma behaviors of the children in their care are adoptive parents. And we certainly see that if you look at why adoptions fail, if you look at any of the group homes that are full of failed adoptions, it is invariably because of some type of sexual acting out from one child in the home to another that adoptive parents and foster caregivers often just don't understand. They don't understand why these kids are doing this. And over the years, we got into the 90s and we got into a really regrettable period of nailing kids as sex offenders. And it didn't matter if they were 6. That you could say this kid is going to grow up to be a sex offender. This kid is a sex offender. One of the very first clients that Circle of Friends had was a 9-year-old boy. And in his record was a statement from the law enforcement officer who was first called to his house saying, this boy is a sex offender. In fact, this kid had been pretty badly sexualized by his father, but it's just a lot of this is very misunderstood. So we're going to look at a lot of different responses. We're going to talk about Michael Jackson, because Michael Jackson and what happened to Michael Jackson and the children that he allegedly molested is a really good example of one kind of response to being sexually traumatized. There are other more acting out kinds of responses, and we're going to look at that too. And we're going to talk about child-on-child reporting, because child-on-child reporting is one of the very misunderstood things that we misuse all the time in child welfare. And we'll talk about the policy that Circle of Friends has about child-on-child and why we put that together, and why we utilize it the way we did. So this is the recap of Module A, because in Module A, and the reason I sent you guys this handout yesterday I took all the videos out, is that there are 3 slides in here that I want you to have in your hands so you can actually read them. And one is the difference between normal and abnormal sexual behavior and what we expect of our kids as normal. Sexuality is normal. It is not an abnormal reaction. Hold on, I think I've got somebody else that's come in here. If people don't do this in time, I don't know how to fix it. So I think I've got everybody. Janet, I already let you in, and there's somebody else here that I think I just let in.
Barbara?
Yes.
Oh, it's Elizabeth. I switched from Zoom. I have to use my phone now.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to make sure.
Okay.
All right. Just wanted to make sure everybody was in. Okay. We talk in Module A, and one of the things that we went over when I did this training for childcare staff, and actually I did this 10 years ago. I revised it, but some things happened in child welfare about 10 years ago, where a lot of kids were being nailed as juvenile sex offenders. And that's a very unfortunate thing to have carry you through the rest of your life. So we put together this training and talked a lot about all kids have sexual behaviors, don't they? I mean, babies play with themselves when they're being changed. All kids do something as they're growing up. It's not abnormal. But those of you who hopefully have been raised in fairly normal households have caretakers who help you to understand what normal sexuality is. I'm sure that if you were little and you were sitting in the living room and maybe you were watching TV and you were tired and you started to masturbate, maybe your mommy would come in and say, honey, don't do that out here. You have to go into the bedroom to do that. We taught our children how to be normally sexual. We taught our children their sense of sexual self. We taught them that it's okay, but it has certain parameters around it. And we don't expect a 6-year-old to be humping their dolls. We do expect a pubertal teenager to be fooling around and making out. There's different kinds of normal sexual behavior. What we find with our sexually maltreated kids is that they just have a very distorted sense of sexuality. So a lot of what you're going to be doing in working with them is really psychoeducation. And who are we aiming in at? Frankly, it's the caregivers, because our caregivers are the ones who really don't understand when they adopt a child or when they take maybe a child in as a relative caregiver and that child begins to have sexual acting out behaviors. The caregivers don't often understand that, and they get very antsy and call the case manager and want the kid out of here. So our goals for working with all kids that we have that are displaying sexual behaviors are certainly not to shame them. And believe me, we've gone through a period where we did that. We want to keep all the kids in homes safe from each other, safe from themselves. And we've had to do some very specific things with that over the years. I worked at an agency called Neighbor to Family, which is now up in Daytona Beach. And they really were ahead of their time in many of the things that they did, but they kept siblings together, and they had siblings in sharing bedrooms. And they ended up having to get very, very complicated technologically. They had to put electric fences around, I don't mean electric fences that would zap the kids, but electric fences around kids' beds, so that if a child got out of their bed and was trying to go into another child's bedroom, the foster parent would be alerted and come out and redirect the child. A lot of this was aimed at keeping all of the kids in care safe. And certainly our goal is to help these kids reverse their distorted sense of sexuality. So for that, we have to understand ourselves. There's a whole period or thing in Module A where we talk about how did you learn about sex, and who taught you about sex. And usually it's your friends. It's very, very infrequently is it your mother, but it's usually your friends. And do your friends get it right? No, they don't. But that's often how we learn about sexuality. You have to understand how you learned about it. You have to understand what your family biases are, perhaps, or any biases that you've grown up with around sexuality. We're all taught things. It's not always good stuff, but we're all taught things as we grow up. It doesn't mean that you don't have biases about how people should and shouldn't behave. You just have to know what they are so that you can be aware of them in treatment. So I'm going to show you this video. I believe this is 5 years old. And this is Dale King interviewing two young men who were allegedly molested by Michael Jackson. And I want you to watch their behaviors as they're talking about him, because I don't think you're going to see that they're angry with him. I think you're going to see that they're very conflicted about him.
Only on CBS this morning, two men who say that Michael Jackson sexually abused them as children are opening up about their experiences with the pop icon. Wade Robson and James Safechuck are featured in an explosive new documentary that premieres this weekend on HBO. Both men also sued the Jackson estate, but their lawsuits were dismissed because of the statute of limitations. They are appealing that. Jackson has always denied any inappropriate behavior with children. Robson and Safechuck told us about their relationships with Jackson, including very graphic allegations of abuse. A warning here, some of these details are quite disturbing. Before you all met Michael Jackson, what did he mean to you?
I saw the making of Thriller, just instantly became obsessed. I wanted to be just like, and I dressed like him every day, and had my hair permed to look like him, and all that stuff.
I wasn't necessarily a big fan. And then when I got the commercial,
Mr. Jackson?
the
Pepsi commercial.
Yeah, the Pepsi commercial. When You See Me Meet Him is actually my first time seeing him. At that point I was pretty excited. It was otherworldly, I guess.
James Safechuck and Wade Robson discuss the intimate details of their relationships with Michael Jackson
Everybody wanted to meet Michael or be with Michael.
in the upcoming HBO documentary Leaving Neverland. That's the name of Jackson's ranch, where Robson claims 7 years of sexual abuse with the world-famous performer first began.
I mean, this was just the most magical thing I'd ever seen. And that first night, Michael kind of took us on a little bit of a tour, and he said to me and my sister, "You can stay in one of the guest rooms, or you can stay in here with me if you want." And my reaction was, of course, I want to stay with you. We had one more night that way. Myself and my family were going to leave and go on another kind of vacation to the Grand Canyon. I was devastated to leave Michael. Michael was devastated for me to leave. He actually sobbed.
So you got to stay.
So I got to stay. And so it was just Michael and I in Neverland for the next week.
And your parents allowed that?
My parents allowed that. Within either the first or second night of Michael and I being alone at Neverland, the night started changing. One of the ways I remember it starting is Michael just sort of starting to touch my legs and touch my crotch over my pants. It progressed to him performing oral sex on me, him showing me how to perform oral sex on him.
Did it scare you? Did you think it was wrong?
A couple days prior, to the abuse starting. He started touching me just in the sense of like hand on my leg, lots of hugs, kissing my forehead, rubbing my hand. So there had been this kind of development of physical closeness that was happening already that felt like a father. It just felt amazing. As Michael started doing these sexual acts, he started talking to me about God brought us together. We love each other, and this is how
We love each other.
we love each other, and this is how we show each other our love.
James, you're nodding in agreement to what he's saying. Tell me what happened to you.
He introduced me to masturbation. Said I call him not a French kiss. And then it moves on to
Go, 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 go.
Are you frightened or thinking this is weird or wrong?
No, it's in the context of a loving, close relationship. There's no alarm
Whoa.
and any thoughts like that. Really, it's just I love this person and they're trying to make each other happy. He said I was his first, but even as a kid, you don't even know what that means. So your lovers and your best friends,
What does that mean, James? You're in a relationship and you're lovers. You're a little boy,
right?
and he's a 30-something man, and you're a little boy. Because at that age, how do you even know what that means?
You don't. You just feel really connected to someone, and you just love them intensely.
The public in general thinks it's violent, that it's very painful, but what you're describing is totally the opposite of that.
I mean, he didn't beat me. He didn't, he never said mean things to me. It was all, we love each other.
In spite of what they're claiming today, in 1993, both Robson and Safechuck denied being molested by Jackson when allegations were brought by another boy, Jordan Chandler. That case settled out of court. You all both tell a very descriptive story about, sexual activity with Michael Jackson. Yet, when you were asked to testify in 2005, and Wade, you did, you got on the stand and you testified in his behalf and vehemently denied that any sexual activity had taken place.
Yes.
Why did you do that?
The training, Michael's training of me to testify began the first night that he started abusing me. He started telling me that if anybody else ever finds out, we'll both go to jail. Both of our lives will be over.
The 2005 criminal trial of Michael Jackson centered on molestation charges brought by child cancer survivor named Gavin Arvizo. Court testimony shows that from the stand, Wade Robson denied ever kissing, showering, or even cuddling with Jackson. They credit your testimony in part for Michael's acquittal. You were called really a star witness. You withstood a blistering cross-examination, and he was acquitted. On some level, do you feel guilty about that now? Do you think about that?
Yeah, I do think about that. I have, and I do. I wish that I was ready. I wish that I could have helped Gavin Arvizo receive some justice and some validation for what happened to him. It was just like what happened to me and just like what happened to James. And I wish that I could have played a role in, at that point, stopping Michael from abusing however many other kids he did after that.
Do you think that there are others out there?
I do think there are others out there, but I also don't expect them to just come out now that we're coming out. It's such a difficult thing to do, to come out. You have to do it when you're ready.
We can't change what happened to us. It happened, it's done. But what can we do with it now? How can we provide comfort for other survivors? That's what this is about. And Michael just happens to be the guy, the abuser in this child sexual abuse story.
Now, we talked to the Jackson family yesterday, and they say these men, we should point out again, according to the Jackson family, they're admitted liars and opportunists who are now trying to capitalize on Michael Jackson's death and exploit the Jackson name. Neither one of these men were paid for appearing in the documentary. They will get nothing for appearing, but they think it's important, they say, to tell their story. And they want people to know. And I thought it was interesting when they said, when you think of child sexual abuse, you think that it's a very frightening, painful thing. But for them, they didn't even know that anything wrong was happening to them because they're little boys.
You can't overlook the detail that they
Yeah, it's
provided
very
too about
detailed.
how that relationship evolved.
And what's so powerful about the detail is not the acts, it's
Yes.
the narrative and the fact that both of them didn't know each other and the
No,
fact
they
that they
didn't.
both heard a version of the same very surprising and complicated narrative from, or they claim from Michael Jackson, and that those two things are similar.
And each one of them said they thought they were the only one in keeping the secret. Keeping the secret is the thing that often takes you down.
I've said it
You've had
before,
a lot of problems
abuse
since then.
fosters in silence.
Exactly.
And it's only until people begin to speak out about it and expose it that it starts to end.
And that's why they're speaking up.
Okay. I want some reactions to that because this is one aspect of being molested. It's also, they're both boys, which makes it difficult. Boys react very differently to what happened in terms of abuse than girls do. We are much more apt to look at a little boy as being a willing participant, even though they're little boys. But one of the points that Gayle King made was, can a 30-year-old and a 5-year-old be in love? Reactions to this, please.
No.
I have one, Barb. Oh.
Go ahead, Carol.
Not in love, I don't think, but even being in love is a difficult concept to, I think, explain for adults. But because they weren't hurt, I find that interesting. They weren't hurt, and he talked in terms of love. I could see them. I'm surprised that they're not afraid. You know, that it didn't hurt, and you know, just that it was almost a nice experience for them. Oh.
Yeah. Somebody else wanted to say something?
He was a master groomer. That's what I think of that experience. And I think it was ridiculous. After I saw that documentary, I cannot listen to a Michael Jackson song.
I know. We've unfortunately ruined Michael Jackson for a lot of people in the child abuse industry, but.
And for her to ask if it was possible for a 5-year-old and however old he was to be in love, I think that to me was for TV, because that's nonsense. That's how I feel about it. Because you wouldn't ask that if it was a girl child and that man.
I think that question comes from them not believing these two guys, because I think that's more of a response of like, what you're saying is ridiculous because love can't occur between, you know, a man and little kids. I think that's more where the question comes from.
Yeah, I don't encourage you to go on this website, but there is a website, and if you go on it, you will get all kinds of cookies, so don't do it, called the North American Man-Boy Love Association. It's NAMBLA. And it is pretty disturbing because it really does perpetrate the belief that men and children can be in love with each other.
Then I will not go on it.
I'm sorry?
I said, then I will not go on it for sure.
No, don't, because I did this many, many years ago, and I was in my house, and Vince, my husband, came in and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm doing some research on NAMBLA, the North American Boy Love Association." And he said, "Are you kidding me?" Because then I got all kinds of stuff that I won't explain, but yeah, it's there. Well, and also Michael Jackson was one of the most famous people in the world. And these two particular boys were in the entertainment industry. That's how they got to know him. They were both in, one of them was in a Pepsi commercial with him, and I forget how the other one was connected, but their parents allowed them to stay without thinking anything of it because it was Michael Jackson. The other thing I want you to look at, did these boys or men seem angry? They didn't seem angry. They seemed sad. And why do you think they finally came forward in 2019? What had happened by 2019?
I think he had passed away by then.
Yeah, he was dead. By the time they did not come forward. And you're going to find this if you work with adults that you've discovered have childhood abuse histories, you may very well find that kids do not come forward until they are either removed from the perpetrator or the perpetrator dies. Certainly, when I had my private practice, it was at a time when it was the 90s. and it was before I moved here. And it was a time when a lot of women were beginning to recognize that what happened to them as children were probably abuse. And they would come in and talk about it and say, I never knew that I thought everybody did this. I thought everybody lived like this. I thought everybody's father taught them about sex. So I think the thing with Michael Jackson has many, many layers. And besides the fact that Shanice can't listen to Thriller anymore, I mean, it has many layers, because these kids, when they were children, when it was happening, and one of them said it went on for 7 years, they didn't think anything wrong was going on. It was as they got to be older and they looked around as adults and began to say, oh my God, that shouldn't have happened. And one of them had a wedding ring on. I couldn't tell about the other one, but they didn't come forward until Michael Jackson died. And why do you think they testified so vigorously in 2005 that he had never touched them? Because one of them was the reason that Michael Jackson got off the last trial. And I think that was the cancer survivor, the little boy who I think eventually died of cancer. And they said they weren't ready. They weren't ready to face public scrutiny. But don't you think there's a lot of people that don't believe these two guys? I'm sure they've got plenty of hate mail since.
Well, I've noticed that with, like, for example, there's a documentary about R. Kelly that's on Netflix.
Yeah.
And you have like his fans, the ones that are his diehard fans are the ones that are the kind of like have that sentiment of like not believing any of these claims, because they're so diehard fans that they just don't believe it, no matter how much you put in their face.
Well, yeah, I kind of thank you, Stephen. I forgot about R. Kelly. It's like with a lot of them, with what's his name, Harvey Weinstein. With a lot of these guys, they have power, they have control over people around them. I think that sexual abuse is rampant in the entertainment industry. It's rampant with people who bring their children into the entertainment industry. And these two young men are a perfect example. But I think the thing that I always come away when I watch this is that they were not angry with him. They were sad. They projected a great deal of sadness about the fact that he was somebody loving to them. He didn't hurt them.
I have some ideas about why that is, but I also want to point out that anytime that there's when you hear any case of anyone, especially like a celebrity, that they did some kind of crime, the reaction that they always typically have is one of where they deny it, and it's like the only tool and weapon they have at that time.
Right.
So there's been cases of people denying things, and just because they deny that the thing happened doesn't necessarily mean that denial is true. So that doesn't mean anything when there's a denial statement sent out by these PR teams or the celebrities. Like, the denial means really nothing. It's almost like I don't even know why those statements are even sequestered of those people, because you know that they're in a position where they have no choice but to deny. Because what are they gonna say? Like, oh yeah, I did it. Put the handcuffs on me, take me now. Like, they're not gonna do that.
Well, and I'm sure also, Barbara, that even though they don't look angry, that they are angry. I would imagine their anger is focused more towards their parents for kind of allowing this to happen. Because you got to remember, the parents pretty much gave permission for them to spend the night with, and Michael Jackson's house. And then that other boy was spent a whole week there. So in his mind, the mind of a child, if my parents are saying it's okay, and if I turn around and say something happened, they're afraid that they're going to get mad at them. So, it all goes back to, parents teaching their kids, I trust it. I'm going to trust you, whatever you tell me.
Not only that, but Michael Jackson had like this home that I think was designed to have like all these things that kids would want, like video games and rides and all these things. So them like ratting out Michael Jackson would also mean that they lose access to all those things.
Yeah, it's like telling on Santa Claus.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I want, and we probably need to move on. What I want you to see here is that this is pretty complicated stuff. I have no doubt that what those two young men said happened to them. Having spent as many years as I have in this field, I have no doubt. However, they were maligned as liars. They were maligned by the press, by Michael Jackson's fans. There's no gain in coming out. Think a few years ago when the Me Too movement, or the women's movement, was like exploding all over the place. And all of these people were coming out saying that Harvey Weinstein molested them, and that Kevin Spacey and this one and that one. None of those people gained anything from that. I mean, maybe they were able to say this happened to me, but were they believed? No. So it's a very complicated picture. Now, if you put this, what we're talking about, put it on the mind of an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old, it gets a lot more complicated. These were men who said, I wasn't ready, and now I'm ready. I'm ready to be honest about what happened to me. I'm ready to face what happened to me. But think about the kids that you work with, they're kids, and they don't, either they don't understand what happened, or they're not always clear that this was abuse. And if you work with incest is incredibly complicated, because then you got the person that molested you is supposed to love me. Somebody else want to say something? I heard somebody.
I did really quick. I know that you said that they didn't really gain anything. I think I'm looking at it as they gained some of their own power when they actually came out to say it. And to say, I didn't recognize that, the sadness was, a response. I'm usually looking for crying, tears, not able to talk, and to see a different emotion that really did help to say you really can't put it in a box. You can't say that that the anger, that's why they're doing it, or they're sad. Like, everybody has a different way, and to see the level of manipulation. I was a diehard Michael Jackson fan, like diehard, and I could not put the two together and say, well, this is your profession, and you work with people who have been victims, and they clearly, exhibit signs of victimization. I just couldn't put the two together. Like, just.
Well, Sean, that's extremely well put, because and that's what I'm saying. There's so many layers to some of these situations that when we get a case. And actually, Yanira just took a crazy case the other day with, I think there's 5 little children, that really kind of trying to take that case apart in terms of what happened to these kids, how old they were when they were exposed to some of this stuff, and what their reactions are now. Because now they're little kids and they're acting out sexually all over the place. And the people around them are horrified because they're watching a 6-year-old try to penetrate a 7-year-old, and the caretakers are horrified because they don't understand the situation. So we have to look at our cases and really, it's like peeling an onion. You really have to take them apart. But thank you, LaShawn. I agree with what you said. Do you still listen to Michael Jackson?
No, I can't.
Unfortunately, we did ruin those songs for a lot of people.
They also, I don't think they play the songs as much as they used to on the radio as well. So I think there's also there's less of an exposure of that music anyway.
Right.
Oh,
Well,
no, they sure do. They still play it. Because I'll catch myself like starting to sing it, and then I will like remember the documentary, or just remember, and I'll be like, no, I refuse.
Now, Shanice and LaShawn, and you guys are all raising good points, but remember, we're immersed in this world. We are in this world where we are working all the time with children who have gone through these things that they shouldn't be exposed to. But adoptive parents, foster parents, relative caregivers, they don't know what to do with this stuff. One of the Yanira's case that we got the other day, the policeman put the 7 and 8-year-old in the back of his police car, where they started sexually acting out on each other. And the poor policeman is turning around saying, stop doing that, because he didn't know what was going on. So we are used to this the people that we're working with are not. And that's, we always have to kind of keep that in mind too. Actually, when I was putting this together and I was looking for myths or things that people often say about this situation, this is really mostly what I got. That usually reports of children engaging in sexually abusive activities are blown out of proportion. Not in our world. I mean, they might be in the average first grade, but in our world, we see this happen all the time. I think we do need to expect some sexual play among children. What we have to look at is what's normal and when does it become a problem? When do we have to say, uh-oh, now we've really got a problem? I think we can expect kids who have been abused, who have been physically abused, sexually abused, we can expect them to act out against other kids. That doesn't mean they're sex offenders. It doesn't mean that they're bad. It just means that they are reacting, which is where the whole expression sexual reactivity came in, thank goodness, in the 2000s, that we stopped talking about. We used to call kids victims, then we began to call them offenders. And then finally, we landed on kind of that in-between thing that these kids are sexually reactive. It doesn't make them bad. It doesn't make them sex offenders. And if you don't remember anything else from this training, remember that the majority of kids who experience child sexual abuse do not become adult sex offenders. That's the biggest misconception, that kids who have been abused in childhood, especially boys, are going to become adult sex offenders. That research does not support that. So when I say these abnormal behaviors don't make these kids juvenile sex offenders or child prostitutes, we're not that far away from that thought process. Until 2013, kids who were acting out sexually were arrested as juvenile sex offenders. They were arrested if they were found on the street as child prostitutes, the whole human trafficking thing. 2013, we passed the Safe Harbor Law. The Safe Harbor Law basically said that kids cannot consent to sex with adults. It doesn't matter what they do. It doesn't matter how they act. They are not capable of consenting. And we stopped arresting these kids. We stopped putting them in juvenile facilities for sexual acting out behavior. We began to see that they needed to be treated and needed to be helped. So, and again, I guess I put this slide in there twice because I want you to remember it. Sexually reactive kids are not destined to be adult sex offenders. And we have to really remember that. And I say that because I know there are programs where kids who have been acting out sexually are treated as adult sex offenders. The treatment for adult sex offenders is very, very different than the treatment that we're providing to children who've been sexually abused. And it doesn't matter what the acting out is. These are not adult sex offenders. All right, our kids have all this stuff, don't they? These are the things that are going to contribute to sexual behavioral problems in children and youth. Our kids have all of these things. Our kids in foster care have all of these issues. They have developmental immaturity. They don't have any social skills. They don't know how to do things. People haven't taught them things, but they have learned this behavior. The 7 and the 8-year-old in the back of the police cruiser learned the behavior. When actually Jim Beller did the CBHA on all of those children. And I was reviewing his CBHA. And at one point I thought, I can't tell who's had sex with whom at this point. It's like everybody on every level of this family had sex with everybody else. And these children had learned some very, very specific behaviors. So their learned behavior that's what they were doing. I think that because of their youth, we probably will have some pretty good success reversing some of that learning. But it has to start with them being placed in foster care, where the foster parents don't freak out every time the child does something. And again, psychoeducation to your caregivers is going to be really critical to you working with these kids, because part of the problem you're going to have is that the caregivers are going to freak out. And we're trying to teach them that these kids have just been exposed to this. Did somebody want to say something? I heard somebody unmute.
Barbara, I have a question, and it's just regarding those children. Are they together in the same home, or did they get split up? Or
They got split up, of course. There was 5 of them, and they got split up. Whether or not, probably because it was 5 of them, and they were little, and there just wasn't a home that could take all 5 of them. But I think, and I don't know where the root of Carol's question, but I think a lot of what we have to do is to teach all of them as a sibling unit how to behave with each other. And they're little, so I think we can do it, provided we don't have foster parents that are freaking out on us all over the place.
yeah, that's where I was kind of going with that.
Yeah, for sure. We have never shied away from these cases. I mean, that's why we have Shanice, we have Yanira, we have different people that are on the call, Bonnie, that are on the sexual trauma team, and we don't shy away from these cases. But I have to tell you, there's not a lot of agencies that do the work that we do with these kids. And sometimes when I read the reports from other agencies about the children that we're now trying to work with, the therapists, the caregivers, the child care workers are so far off the mark on what should happen with these kids. And that's why it's important that we make sure we know what we're doing. Sexual confusion, we see that a lot more with boys than we do with girls. These 2 young men, it sounds like Shanice saw the whole documentary. I did not. So I don't know what the backgrounds of those 2 young men were. I don't know if they were gay, if they were straight. Shanice, can you shed any light on that?
I don't know if they were gay or straight. They were pretty young when they started seeing Michael Jackson, so possibly straight, or maybe they didn't know. But I know one was from Australia. The other one, I don't remember where he was from, maybe California, maybe local. But I know the one from Australia, I want to say that was the one where his mom would literally let Michael Jackson take him for like months at a time, and mom would come over too, and she would spend, weekends or weeks in the house with him, and they would be in separate areas of the house. Michael Jackson would be with the kid in one area of the house, and she would be on another area of the house, and she thought nothing of it. It was awful. And I want to say you did see a wedding ring on one hand. The other guy, he has a lot of relationship issues. I want to say he had said something about like some failed relationships and stuff. So I don't think he's doing very well with his adult relationships, if I remember correctly.
Which was the one from Australia, the one that talked the most?
I don't remember, because I feel like the Wade guy is a dancer or was a dancer. So I don't remember which one is from Australia.
Okay. Well, it's interesting because again, I haven't seen the whole, I guess I got to look at the whole thing now. That when you say the mother didn't think anything of it, maybe she did. I mean, these kids were in the entertainment industry. There was a lot to be gained from an association with Michael Jackson. And when you really get into the family relationships with some of these kids, and again, I don't know about these 2 young men, but when you get into the family relationships, you do see that the caregiver who should have protected kind of knew what was going on, but didn't protect. And there was a lot financially, I'm sure, for them spending time with Michael Jackson at the height of his career. So she may or she may not have known what was going on. It's probably why Shanice had a hard time watching it. It's a very complicated situation. What I find with a lot of, I think somebody's trying to call me. What I find with a lot of boys is that they do have sexual confusion about whether or not they caused this, whether or not they created it. That's why we have the book, It Happens to Boys Too, that I've always touted that you guys really should use with your young male clients, because it really does talk about that whole sexual confusion. And I've really rarely found anything that works as well for young boys. So why do these kids do this? We have all of these factors that are affecting their behavior. But as you saw with those two young men, they would say that they weren't even sure that anything bad was happening to them. Because in many, many cases, you know, we always think that sexual abuse victims are dragged off into the bushes and raped. That's not how most of it is. And if you have a client that you're working with who was in an incest family, a lot of kids in incest families really don't know that there's anything abnormal about what's happening in their families. How do they find out? They find out because they go to school and they say to their friend in math class, you know, something about that their dad did to them. And the friend says, oh no, I don't think you should, that's not right. That's how a lot of incest kids find out that what's happening to them is abnormal. Because if you think about this, until we get them and get them into the child welfare system, incest families are very isolated. I had to do an event at Florida United Methodist. It's called Day on Campus. It was two Saturdays ago. It's an all-day affair. And I was going to give a talk in the chapel to people. These are all people that come from all over the state to support the children's home. So these are lay people. These are not people that know anything about this kind of stuff. And I was going to give a talk on trauma and explain to them how all of this works. And it's always difficult to do with lay people because you don't know how gory you can get. I mean, we get pretty gory when we talk about some of the stuff that we talk about, but as I was getting ready to go in, a young lady walked up to me. She was holding a baby in her arms and she was pregnant, and she started talking to me. And she then turned to, I assume, her husband and said, this was my counselor at FUMSH in 1999. And I'm thinking, oh my God, who is this? But I stood there talking to her long enough to figure out who she was. And it had been 20 years. I mean, they kind of come up to you like they saw you yesterday, but I do remember because she was in a sibling group of 5 and they had been adopted and they were brought in. She was 15 when she was brought into the children's home. And it was a very involved incest family. And she had a twin brother. And they had been encouraged to have sex with each other. It was a very, very messy incest case. But none of these children, with the exception of the youngest girl, understood that what was happening to them was wrong. So a lot of the challenge of working with them was kind of helping them to see that what happened to them, number one, was not their fault, that they didn't do anything wrong, that it wasn't their fault, but that the world does not do this. The world does not let your dad teach you about sex. That's not the way the world works. One of those girls in one of that sibling group of 5 was the chosen girl. And I've talked about her in other trainings, and she kept running away. And where was she running? She ran back to them. Every time she ran away, she ran back to the mother and father that had sexually abused her. And I don't know whatever happened to her, but the fact that I'm sitting there 20 years later talking to this girl, and we have all kinds of people around us, so I couldn't exactly say, at what point did you figure out that what was going on with you was not exactly right? But it does look like I'm looking at her thinking, well, you know, you're married, you've got a couple of kids. I hope that life ended up a little bit better for you. But at the time, none of those kids understood that when they came in, except the youngest one. And that's very, very common with sexual trauma that is not physically abusive. You heard those young men say he did not hurt them. And many kids who are molested are not physically injured. If you've worked with kids especially girls. We've had a lot of girls who've been sexually abused who never, the abuse never reached the point of intercourse. And when you would really kind of tease the case apart, why did it not reach the point of intercourse? If this was a father or a brother or an uncle or whatever, what would happen if you tried to have intercourse with a 7-year-old or an 8-year-old? Kind of obvious, but what would happen?
I mean,
I don't know. They
would
have to go to the
hurt.
hospital.
You all said it at the same time. It would hurt. It would hurt, and it could cause damage, which is why what you see, that kind of complicated relationship that Michael Jackson had with those 2 kids, he probably thought he was in love with them. And he convinced them that they were in love with him. But my bet is that he never, well, they said he never physically hurt them. He never hurt them. He never did anything that would cause them extreme discomfort. He didn't do anything to
Well,
their
that
genital
might be
organs.
also a unique situation because I know about Michael Jackson in the sense that he was physically abused by his dad when he was a kid.
Yeah,
So maybe that played a role in him not wanting to physically be abusive to any of the kids
right.
because he didn't want to abuse people in the sense that he was abused.
Yeah. Well, and without turning this into a whole Michael Jackson seminar, there's probably some of that in there too. Generally speaking, with perpetrators who are molesting, especially members of their own family, obviously it's a very distorted relationship. It's a relationship in which the perpetrator makes a lot of excuses for why what they are doing is not wrong. But at the end of the day, they often don't want to create physical pain. And certainly one of the young ladies that I worked with when I was at the Children's Advocacy Center, who gave me quite an education, she was 9, said that her stepfather had bought her some sex toys. And it took a long time. I know that those of you who have listened to me over the years know that I've told the story of this little girl, because she took me a long time to get her to understand that what he did to her was wrong. But he would buy her little sex toys that would kind of stretch her, so that, but then he never got to the point where he penetrated her because he didn't want to hurt her. That was the client that I've talked about, where he would print out things in German and from the internet and say, see, they do this in Germany. They fathers and do this to their daughters in Germany. And she was 9, she couldn't read German. So, but what we're going to look at with a lot of, when I show you the slides, which you won't be able to read because the print is so small, about normal and abnormal behavior, you don't expect a 5-year-old to be humping their dolls, do you? You don't expect a 4-year-old to be seductive with other children. Those are the behaviors that you get alarmed about. There's certain behaviors that we all exhibit as we are growing up. The 5-year-olds that play doctor with each other, none of that's concerning.
That happened on accident. Can a kid learn to hump a doll on accident, or is it always a learned behavior?
Well, how would it happen on accident? Because even if Stephen's, I'm trying to answer Stephen's question, but even if you have the kids that say are living in houses where there are no bedrooms and where there are a lot of adults that are doing things in front of children that they shouldn't be doing, those things shouldn't be happening either. So unless somebody can come up with something creative, I can't think of a way that a child would learn sexually explicit behaviors by accident. They could be watching porn because their parents are watching porn. They could be watching their parents have sex. They could be watching the other adults in the house getting it on with each other. But 4-year-olds don't know how to do that. And we have had our 4 and 5-year-olds who have done those kinds of things, which has been our clue that maybe something happened to them. One of the pictures that I show in one of the other trainings, and I think some of you have seen it, is the little girl named Olivia. She was 4, and the therapist asked her to draw. She drew an outline of a little girl, and she asked Olivia to draw where she was angry, and Olivia drew all these circles in her body where she was angry. And we only had Olivia because she was acting out in the foster home. She was kind of a little bratty 4-year-old. But when she drew the picture, she drew a perfectly positioned penis in between this little girl's legs with milk coming out of it. And when the therapist said, "What is that, Olivia?" she said, "It's the thing between the man's legs. And when he rubs it, milk comes out." So we figured out that she had been molested. I think that story had a happy ending because I think she's about 10 now and she ended up getting adopted. But we wouldn't have known if she hadn't drawn that picture and told us that, because at 4, how would she know that? I realize that there's a lot of crazy stuff going on in Florida, and my issue here is not the politics of Florida, but we have been given various directives by the Surgeon General of Florida about whether or not we should address the needs of our LGBTQ youth. And all I'm going to say is that you have got to do what's best for your clients. I don't care what the political climate is in any state. I don't care what the political climate is in this country, but you have to do what's best for your clients. And if your client is confused about his or her sexuality, if your client wants to have a conversation with you, you are bound by your professional ethics to take care of your clients. When we have kids, it's probably a little less common now, but because I think our children are being exposed to so many options for their sexuality that they didn't have before, that we all need kind of a chart to know what all the terms are. But I think we often have found that boys who are molested grow up or think that they're gay when they're not. And one of our common treatment issues is not to tell kids that they're gay or straight, it's just to help them explore it and figure it out. And mostly it comes at the base of saying, you did not create this. This is not your fault. And kids who have been exposed, especially the transgender youth, we just have to help them deal if they have been molested with what happened and what it means for what they think their sexuality is. And that's another whole layer, isn't it, of complication that you have to deal with here. So there's a purpose for this behavior. And it really, the sexually problematic or abusive behaviors have a purpose. There's a reason why kids do the things that they do. Usually it's about control. And LaShawn made a really good point when she said that these 2 young men probably got back a sense of control over what had happened to them, because usually kids don't have any control over what happens to them. And often when we get our kids, it's right after they've been pulled and placed in foster care. They're confused, they're frightened, they don't feel safe. And they're very often not apt to tell us what happened right away, if they ever tell us at all, which is why things like Olivia's drawing or some of our sand tray exercises is some of the things that we do with our kids. It don't have to do with words. They don't have to do with that kid sitting down and saying, this is what happened to me. Because they really may not quite understand what happened to them. But we also find that kids who have gone through these experiences are just in a perpetual state of heightened arousal. If you look at some of the children that you work with compared to maybe if you have your own children, or you're around children that have grown up in quotes normal households, you don't see that constant hypervigilance that you see in children that we are working with. And sometimes masturbation is just a way to relieve that anxiety. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures here, and then maybe we'll take a little break, okay? How do kids let us know that they have been molested? This kid was 10. And he had been exposed to some sexual behavior in his family of origin before he was pulled and placed in foster care. But he drew a whole series of these pictures. And if you look at, I've still got them. I always save crazy stuff like that, but I've got a whole series of pictures that he drew on his school composition pad. And you can kind of see, because he drew them on both sides, this is on the other side of the picture. And this was a very sexually explicit picture of a female, because you can see the breasts. But what might be odd about this? Well, for one thing, it's a drawing of a gorilla, but what might be odd about that? What might you notice about this drawing of a gorilla?
How old did you say the boy was again?
10. If you're going to draw a gorilla, for whatever reason that you're going to draw a gorilla, would you draw it with these particular attributes? What is that?
There's genitalia drawn.
Right, yeah.
And it looked like he erased the drawing of a girl naked that was under that.
Actually, this was on the other side of the page. It just that he was drawing in pencil and it bled through when I was trying to make copies. But yeah, this was a sexually explicit picture of a girl. It's on the other side. What does this gorilla have? Carol's right. He's got genitalia. He's also got breasts.
He looks like maybe he's grabbing it, maybe.
Yeah. I think if I showed you all these pictures, I actually used these pictures. I was doing a training up in Daytona Beach for the local police department. And even the cops thought this was gross. But he drew a whole series of pictures of, well, the gorilla was kind of like the beginning. And then he went on to, this was, I think he said he was drawing his sister, but it looked like a cartoon character. But
I think it's also kind of strange for him to think about animals having genitalia, because I'll tell you what, like, I don't think it was a thought that I had as a kid of like considering the genitalia on any kind of animal at all.
Well, you might if you had been molested. And I guess that's the point that I'm trying to make. The kids that have been molested, think about this stuff, draw this stuff in. And that's what I mean about this is not normal behavior. The pictures that he drew of that female character being sodomized, which I don't usually use because they're pretty gross. He was really trying to tell his foster mother that this is what had happened. I think the gorilla was just the easiest, but I'm looking at LaShawn's laughing. I think she's had this experience before, but kids draw things that they're trying to tell you something. Would you expect to see an animal with genitalia? You wouldn't. Would you expect to see Olivia draw a penis with milk coming out when she's 4 years old? You wouldn't. But that's often how kids will tell you what happened to them. And that's what he was trying to do. And this one, this kid drew this for me on a whiteboard. So I had to take a picture of it on the whiteboard because I didn't want to lose it. But she was a 5-year-old. She was a sexual trauma victim, and her father had been the perpetrator. And this was a family up in Daytona Beach. They were a fairly well-to-do family. And I don't remember now the circumstances under why this happened, but the father never physically hurt her. And she didn't, when I got her, I was working at the Children's Advocacy Center. She didn't think that anything bad had happened to her. And it was Valentine's Day when she drew this picture. So she drew the picture, she drew the 3 hearts, and she did it in about 2 seconds. And she said, well, this is me, and this is Dad, and this is whoever her brother was. And I said to her, what's this at the bottom? And she said, the butterflies at the bottom of the hearts are checking their privates. And I just thought, God, that's perfect. Because what 5-year-old is going to draw a Valentine with butterflies checking their privates? She really understood that something abnormal had happened to her. She just didn't know what it was. And again, he didn't hurt her. He masturbated her a lot. He touched her a lot, but he didn't hurt her. He checked her privates, and that's what she was trying to show me. All right, before we get into this section, it's 10 after 10. You guys want to take a break and grab some coffee or whatever, and just take 10 minutes, come back at 20 after. Does that work?
Okay. Yes.
Coffee.
Okay, can we get started again? You guys ready?
Yep, I'm back.
Yep, I'm ready.
Me too.
Let's go.
Okay. All right. I was just looking at the chat. Carol was reminding me about Jeffrey Epstein, which I forgot about him. I was mixing him up with Harvey Weinstein. There's so many of them, it's hard to keep track. So, okay. We're going to look at some situations. And when I say how would you react and how should you react, we're all human. And some of these things that happen, especially if you are the foster parent or the adoptive parent, and it's Saturday night and it's 7 o'clock and you can't get in touch with anybody, and these things happen and you don't know what to do. We have certainly seen a lot of foster parents and certainly a lot of adoptive parents who've really overreacted to things and gotten extremely upset about things that have happened. And the problem with overreacting is that overreaction can do harm, and we don't want that. But I also recognize that people are human. So most of these things, when I use samples or examples, it's always something that happened to me, because at least I know how I did or didn't react to it correctly. And we don't always react to things correctly. So, but this, and this, when I presented this at the SEC last week, 2 weeks ago, whatever, I said, this is a perfect example for therapists that when you have a therapy session, you need to make sure that when you send that child out of your therapy session, that you have made some attempt to put that child back together. If you have had a difficult conversation, if you have spent time talking to them about some of their difficult history, you don't do it right up to the hour and then spit them out and say, now go back to geography, kid. And this was a situation where there was 14-year-old foster son, and he had been pretty severely molested. He was in a foster home, and he was doing pretty good. He was seeing a therapist, and he was making some reasonable progress in therapy. But he came back to the foster home after a session, and the 3-year-old daughter of the foster parents was sitting on the floor, and she was watching television. And as the foster mom said to me afterwards, I could see them from the kitchen. I could see them through whatever the Dutch door was in the kitchen. And she said, I could see my little girl. She was sitting on the floor, and he came in and said, hi, and how are you doing? But what he did was he went behind the couch, and he manipulated the little girl to come behind the couch, and then he fondled her. He didn't hurt her. He just fondled her. She liked him. So she, because she was 3, didn't think very much of it, but she came out, and now foster mother looks up, the kid's sitting watching television again. And nobody knew what had happened until later, when the little girl just told her mother that she'd been playing behind the couch with whatever his name was, and that he had, quotes, touched her privates. And they were extremely upset. But as we you always need to be calming people down in these situations. So as we determined what happened, made sure that the little girl was okay, that she knew that she hadn't done anything wrong, and that she was safe and she hadn't been hurt. And then I turned my attention to the boy. And he pretty much told me that he had had a really good session with his therapist, but they were talking a lot about some really hard stuff. And she kept him going right up to the point that the therapy session was over. And then she sent him out, and he went back to the foster home. And we had some good remedial work with the 14-year-olds, and then I turned my attention to the therapist and said, you really got to give kids a little bit of time to put them back together. If they're going back into class, if they're going back to their foster home where mom's making dinner, you want to make sure that you've done something to kind of close them up a little bit and make them feel that they're back in the real world and they're safe. Now, when I say how would you react and how should you react, the foster parents were very upset with the boy. And we really had to do some sitting down and talking through what had happened here. And then doing some talking, not that I was blaming the therapist, but just good practice should tell you that you just have to put things back together. So the happy ending to that story is that they were good foster parents, and they were willing to say, yeah, I'll pay more attention when he comes back in. And we just made sure that the 14-year-old was safe, the 3-year-old was safe, and that the foster parents had calmed down. Second story is another one that actually happened to the sister of the kid that came up to me at Day on Campus. But she was 10. She was the only one of this 5-sibling group that really knew that something had happened to her. But she had been molested from the time she was 6. She was placed in a foster home, and she asked the foster father to read her a story. And while she's sitting next to him, she started to stroke his leg, and she started to touch his genital area. And good foster parents can make such gold out of situations like this. And this foster father did make gold out of this situation, because she was brand new to his home. And he just said to her, honey, that's not what I want you to do. That's not what we ask children to do in this household. And if we have time, I'm going to show you the video that we did about the sexual safety plan. But this foster father knew the sexual safety plan, and he was able to refocus her. He was able to reassure her that she hadn't done anything wrong. He was able to say that's not what adults in this household ask children to do. So he was able to make some gold out of that situation. And I've told this story because this story goes on and on and on, but the story of the bologna sandwich. The 16-year-old foster daughter had been molested by just about everybody. She'd been molested by her father, stepfather, but she'd been a really, really model child in this foster home. And one Saturday, while they were all house cleaning together, the foster father was outside, he was mowing the lawn, and foster mom is inside with the girl. And she said to her, why don't we take a break and I'll make you something for lunch? Would you like a bologna sandwich? And the foster daughter just flew into this rage, and she tried to choke this foster mother, and the foster mother wasn't very big. So she knocked her over. She was choking her. The foster mom was screaming. The dad heard the noise and came in and said, pulled her off. But it was a Saturday. They didn't have anybody on call to call. They didn't have a therapist to call. They didn't have a case manager to call. So they had to figure it out. And foster dad said, we sat down. That's why we train our foster parents to really make gold out of bad situations. And they all sat down. She calmed down, and they all sat down. And she was able to tell them that whenever her father wanted to have sex with her, most abusers have signals, don't they? It's probably no different than husband and wife when you know that tonight's the night. Most abusers have signals. His signal to her was, let's have a bologna sandwich. And that was how he let her know that he was coming into her bedroom that night. So what happened here was that she was triggered. And you're going to have to help foster parents understand triggers, because triggers are great clues as to what's happening here. Triggers are great clues to say, okay, I know that that's going to get this kid going. So we're going to avoid it, but we're going to try to figure out how we can help that kid work through that trigger. So these were, again, good foster parents. Good foster parents can make really good stuff out of bad stuff. And I use this one just because I don't think I'll ever find another one like this, but I had been living in Florida for 3 weeks when this happened. I had gotten a job. As most of you know, my first job was at Florida United Methodist Children's Home. And this was in 1998. And I had a cottage full of girls. I had 8 girls. They were all between the ages of 13 and 15. And they all had a history of molestation. Now, here's the thing about the difference between 2023 and 1998. When I came here in 1998, I had come from Massachusetts, and I had been working in sexual trauma in Massachusetts, which had a fairly advanced system of care at the time for working with sexual trauma victims. I did not know that Florida did not have that at that point in 1998. So I knew, because I had already met with all these girls, because that was my job, I thought, and I knew just from talking to them that they had all been molested by uncles, brothers, whatever. But I thought they had all had treatment. I didn't realize, because they were in a children's home, I was mistakenly thinking that these girls had all been treated. Now, again, I'd only been here for 3 weeks, so, but the foster mother came in the next day, and I find the foster mother and the cottage parent, whatever you wanted to call her, was sitting on the porch. And she looked like she'd gone 10 rounds in a bad fight. And so I got out of the car, I went over, I said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "Well, last night I heard noise in the bathrooms, and I walked in and I found 3 of these girls involved in sexual activity with each other." Now, again, this is 1998. The world has changed a lot since then. And in those cottages at the time, they've since been renovated. There were 2 girls in a bedroom, 2 girls in a bedroom, and a shared bathroom. So all of those cottages were constructed like that. So what actually did that mean? That meant that every night, 4 kids had access to each other in a bathroom, and they used it. So, and that is what had happened that night. So I came in, I find them all in there. They all think that they're going to jail. And the 2 younger kids began to blame the older girl. And they said, "Well, she's a lesbian. She forced herself on them." And the older girl said the 2 younger girls participated willingly. Now, how did I react? I'll tell you, that was a real learning curve for me, because that was when I'm looking at myself saying, wait a minute, these kids haven't had any treatment at all. They're all telling me this stuff like nobody had ever asked them anything about this. And the only good thing I can say, other than the fact that I had to send the poor childcare worker off to the Olive Garden with a gift card or something, was that it was kind of like opening the door to allowing these kids to realize that everybody had had some kind of a bad sexual experience, and that maybe it was time to talk about it. So was it a great situation? It was not a great situation. It was also one of the things that I finally began to say, should these cottages be constructed this way? They have since been renovated. But at the time, that shows you how different treatment was and where we were in treatment in 1998 than where we are in 2023. And in 2023, we have sexual safety plans. We have room monitors. A lot of foster homes have electronic monitoring to make sure the kids don't get out of bed and get into other places. We have safety plans for kids who have come in that have had sexual trauma experience, where they have to sign the safety plan and say that you cannot go into anybody else's bedroom. You can't, if you're in the bathroom, you have to stay by yourself in the bathroom. All of that stuff has evolved since that time. But at that time, it was a different time. So be glad perhaps that you're living now, where at least we have some awareness of what we need to do here. And I'm not going to do this one. This one is a little rough, and I think I'll just move right along here. I think what I learned from going through all of those things, because like I said, I only use things that have happened to me. I don't know what happened to you. But I think we certainly learn over the years that kids act out their abuse in some way. They draw it, they put it in a sand tray, they act it out with you when you're trying to read them a story. They do sexual things, they hump their dolls, they draw gorillas with penises. Kids are going to let you know in some way that something has happened. What you have to be prepared for is that they don't always know that it was wrong. And we can never jump into this immediately thinking that they know that what happened to them was wrong, because part of your job is to help them to understand that it wasn't their fault, that you're going to keep them safe, and that it shouldn't have happened to them. And sometimes that takes a little while. Takes a little while. With the little girl that I talked about before, that the foster dad or the stepfather gave her the German newspapers and said, see, this proves that this happens in Germany, and she couldn't read German. I think I had her for going on 2 to 3 months before finally one day she asked me where her stepdad was. And I said, well, he's in jail. And she said, why? And I said, well, because there's a lot of people that don't think that what Steve did to you was the right thing to do. And she said, like who? And I said, well, there's a judge, there's a policeman, there's your mother, who don't think that what he did to you was right, because she kept telling me that Steve was her boyfriend and that it was her mother's fault that Steve had to leave because her mother was jealous of her. Remember, she was 9. So after listening about Steve being her boyfriend, how great Steve was and all the things that Steve did that were so wonderful for almost 3 months, I had this conversation with her one day. And I said, well, the judge didn't think it was right. The policeman didn't think it was right. Your mom didn't think it was right. And I didn't think it was right. And she just looked at me and said, I knew that. So sometimes it just takes a while. You got to sit on your hands a little bit. And we can never assume that they're okay. And I can't say that strongly enough. I don't care what kids look like. I don't care how benign they act. You can never assume that they're perfectly okay. And we certainly know that some behaviors are more concerning than others. The reason I sent you all this is that I know you can't sit here and read this, but I wanted you to have these charts just for your own awareness. And this is expected sexual development. We expect kids to do this at preschool, at that, we used to call it the latency age, that 5 to 10. We expect kids in adolescence and pre-adolescence to begin to focus more on their sexuality. We expect little kids to explore their private parts. We expect them to maybe play doctor or play house. We expect little kids to become very interested in their bathroom activities. And that's in its own way is kind of a pre-sexual behavior. If you have a little kid now and you're trying to toilet train them, they often want to see what it is before you flush the toilet. They're interested in what's happened and what's coming out of their bodies, but that's normal. We expect children to do that. We expect that 5 to 10 is that they'll begin to do some kind of silly stuff. What I always say about this age range is when you look at a playground and you look at kids in this age range on the playground, what are they doing? What do you see kids doing on the playground?
They run around, they play with each other. They typically all go wherever all the kids are.
Yep. Yeah, they chase each other. And, really chasing each other around the playground is kind of that 5th graders foreplay. They never catch each other. They chase each other around. We expect to see them doing that. We expect to see what we used to call it, the whole kissing games and all of that, kiss, spin the bottle, that kind of silly stuff. It's usually in normal sexuality, it's not threatening. It's just a little bit silly. And
Yeah, and kids will make friends with strangers that are in the playground real fast.
right, which we hope not.
No, I mean
think-
like other stranger children, like they
Mhm.
don't know those children.
Right, right. You're gonna play. You're just gonna play. You're gonna be aware. That's in the age range where you begin to look at other kids. It's also where bullying starts, because it's where we begin to notice if kids are attractive or not attractive, or if they're doing anything that's odd that other kids would pick on them for. But we expect them to do that. And by the time they get to be into their adolescence, that's when we expect that we got to start watching them. That's when you don't want to have your kids shut the door and have a computer in their room, because they are going to get into things. They are going to get into sexual touching. They are going to start to focus on sexuality. One of the trainings that we were going to do, but we haven't quite developed it yet, was about pornography. And there's a website that has a lot of little 5-minute videos about pornography and what happens at different ages if children are exposed to pornography, and what happens to the brain of a teenager that gets exposed to a lot of pornography and then becomes addicted. It is a very addictive behavior at that age that we would be concerned about. The kid that's occasionally trying to sneak something to watch, that's just kind of what kids do. The kid that sits there hour after hour after hour and can't tear himself away from pornography, yeah, we would be concerned about that. But this is normal. Kids have sexual development. That's what they're going to do. If we begin to see any of these things, this is when we begin to get worried. If we see kids that are really focusing on sexual behavior beyond what we expect them to do at that age, we don't expect a 4-year-old to hump their dolls. We don't expect a 5-year-old to simulate sexual intercourse. We don't expect kids to really try to persistently engage in some kind of sexual contact with other kids, whether they know them or they don't know them. These are the kids that can't stop masturbating. These are the kids that masturbate in places where they shouldn't. And it's hard for the caregiver to redirect them. These are the kids that are really going to look at trying to engage in sexual behavior with kids that are a different age than they are. And the wider the difference, the greater the concern. We're going to talk about child on child in a minute, but all of these are abnormal sexual behaviors. These are kids that are doing things that we just don't expect them to do for their age. And certainly if they're using force or bribery or any kind of threats to get other kids to engage sexually, and we do see that, we really do. Not probably so much for you working with kids in foster homes. If you're working with kids that are in congregate care, there's a whole lot more that we have to be aware of with kids in congregate care. And by congregate care, I'm talking about like group homes. That I'm not sure how many years ago it was probably, I'm going to say maybe 15 years ago, that foster care agencies had to develop sexual safety plans. So if a kid had any kind of a history like this, they could not be placed in a foster home in a room with another child. And in many cases, they couldn't be placed in a foster home with a child that was younger than them. So that severely limited where you could put some of these kids, because like with the cottages that are over at the children's home now, they have now redone those cottages so that there's one kid in a room and one kid in a room, and they don't have the shared bathrooms anymore. But they're not allowed to have kids in cottages that have had really severe sexual acting out behavior if there are younger kids in the cottage. So again, it's very restrictive of what you can do. But any of these kinds of things we would be concerned about. If you're working with any kids that have come into foster care, it's a new case for you, and the foster mom is describing any of these behaviors, even if there's no history of sexual trauma, yeah, you need to pay attention to this kind of stuff. And just as Olivia drew us her picture and told us what happened to her, kids will show you by their behavior what we need to be concerned about. So let's talk about child-on-child sexual abuse. Because if you're working in like a group home or in a foster home or a child placing agency or any of the agencies who have to follow the dictates of the Department of Children and Families, this is kind of an overused the child-on-child sexual abuse reporting is overused. And it's often overused because if you're working for a DCF contracted facility, you have a lot of liability. But the law says that 3 things have to be present in order for you to call in a child-on-child sexual abuse report. There has to be coercion, there has to be an age or size differential, and there has to be lack of consent. And if those 3 things are not present, we do not call in a child-on-child abuse report. Now, I did this exact training for a foster care agency maybe 2 months ago. And I tried to say as clearly as I could, you have to follow whatever rules you are being told to follow with your agency. I'm telling you what we do as an outpatient mental health agency working at Circle of Friends. We do not call in child-on-child sexual abuse unless those 3 things are present. Now, why do you think places like foster care agencies and case management organizations call them in all the time? Is it all about liability? It's all about liability. And I can also tell you that if you call in a child-on-child sexual abuse report, the hotline's not going to do anything with it. They don't even list a perpetrator. They might do something with it if it is like a 16-year-old who has molested a 6-year-old. But they don't do anything with it. They turn it over to law enforcement. So very often, and I've had to learn this over the years, that very often if you call the hotline with a child-on-child sexual abuse report, number one, they're not going to send out an investigator. It has to have these 3 things in it. And if those 3 things are there, the hotline is going to call the jurisdiction of law enforcement where the child is. And that person and that jurisdiction is going to go out. And when I was one of the times, I think it was 2015, when I was consulting over at the children's home, there was a young boy there. He was from Palatka. He was 9 years old. And he obviously had had a pretty serious molestation record himself. And he had been severely sexually abused. And he didn't act out a lot. He would do things like touch other kids' butts. But every time he did, the therapist would call a hotline and call in a child-on-child sexual abuse report. And I remember at one point saying, you've got to stop doing that, because the policeman, even the policeman would say to me, I'm not going to go talk to this child because all I do is scare him to death. He was only 9. And one of the days that I was there, I saw the police car out in the waiting area, and I went over to talk to him. And I said, are you here about so-and-so again? And he said, yes. And I wish they would really stop calling me because this kid just needs treatment. And that's where it would get down to. If you'd be sitting in a meeting and you'd have, I was in a meeting once where there was somebody from the hotline, there was somebody from law enforcement, and there was me. And all they did was punt it around. And the hotline person said, I'm not going to do anything with this. I'm going to call law enforcement. And law enforcement said to me, I'm not going to do anything with it either. It's a treatment issue. I'm going to turn it over to people like you. So you have to do whatever your agency tells you to do. I mean, we all know that liability is a big thing. And if your agency tells you that you have to call it in, then call it in. But at Circle of Friends, we staff them before we make a decision. And why do we do that? I mean, this is a treatment issue, isn't it? I mean, our job is to help whoever did what to whatever to understand that this is not normal pro-social behavior. This is not something that you should be doing. And maybe this is the why of why you're doing it. That's our job. Our job is treatment. We're not law enforcement officers and we don't work for the department. So, but again, you do whatever your agency tells you to do. And I know that some of you have seen this, but this is consent ST. There is, I actually showed this at the SCC last week. It was probably the thing that people were the most interested in was consent ST. But it talks about consent and it's pretty common sense.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, hey, would you like a cup of tea? And they go, oh my God, I would love a cup of tea. Thank you. Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, hey, would you like a cup of tea? And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you could make them a cup of tea or not, but be aware they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important part, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you are entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say no, thank you, then don't make them tea at all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea. Don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea. They just don't want tea, okay? They might say, yes, please, that's kind of you. And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time that it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind. And you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they're unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea. And they can't answer the question, do you want tea? Because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea. And they said yes. But in the time it took you to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down. Make sure the unconscious person is safe. And this is the important part again. Don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they're safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it going, but you wanted tea last week. Or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat going, but you wanted tea last night. But if you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you're able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand it when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to go make myself a cup of tea.
You can find that on YouTube. There's also consent is, well, this is consent is tea clean, and there's consent is tea dirty, I think. I think it just has some bad language in it. But we kind of use this concept a lot with the kids, especially teenagers, because consent is everything. And when we say you have to have consent, you have to have no size differential or no age differential, and consent and low lack of coercion. Those are the three things you have to have before you're going to file an abuse complaint. And I got that straight from the DCF. We went to one of the seminars we went to at the summit. We always had this argument with different therapists would come in and say, no, we have to call this in. We have to call this in. And I would say, because what happens when you call it in? What happens when you call in a report on maybe two kids that were doing something with each other because both had been molested, they were the same age, they were the same size, and now you find a perpetrator? What happens to the kid that's named as the perpetrator? Now the treatment is different, isn't it? So we want to make sure, because we are therapists, that what we're doing is therapeutically advisable. So if I say which one of these are child on child? If two 6-year-olds are playing doctor, is that child on child abuse? They're both the same age. They're not doing anything that they shouldn't normally be doing within the realm of normal sexual development. They're just playing doctor. And that is not child on child abuse. But if a 12-year-old is going to force a 3-year-old to perform oral sex, that's child on child abuse. And then we do have to call it in, and then we do have to let that whole system play itself out. The difficulty we have anytime this happens is that it is very rare for a child to commit some kind of a sexual act on another child if something hasn't already happened to that child. So once you move it into law enforcement, once you move it into child abuse laws, then treatment for the perpetrator child really does stop. That's why we need to make sure that what we're doing is going to help all concerned. If we have a 15-year-old who's going to coerce a 5-year-old to do something sexual, that's child on child abuse, because you have an age differential, you've got a size differential, you've got coercion, and you don't have consent. A 5-year-old isn't going to be able to consent. So that's why we really, really try to look at it. And please hear me, if this has got to be reported, we report it. But we make sure that we have those 3 elements there, and that at the end of the day, what we're doing is not going to stop treatment. And look at this picture.
Barbara, for that too, a way I could think of that, like how you tell us with children don't start thinking more analytically until they're at least 8 years old.
Right.
So even that, like with consent, definitely a 5-year-old can't do that.
Good point. That's exactly right. And that's one of the things that we do look at. Now, if we were looking at these as kids that we had, I would still want to be concerned about the alleged perpetrator, because there's a reason that 12-year-old is trying to force a 3-year-old to perform oral sex. It's not something that they just woke up in the morning and said, I think I'll do this. So we're always looking at history. And what does this picture look like? What do you see in this picture?
Like
the other person is like a man because he has a beard.
Mm-hmm. Is there a size differential?
Yes.
Yes.
And he has his hands on his throat, so that's
Yeah.
threat.
Right. And the younger boy looks terrified, I think.
He also has his back to the wall, so he can't go anywhere.
Yeah.
I would say, if I only saw this picture, that I would be concerned about the safety of the younger boy. And everything you said is right. He looks scared. This looks like a much older boy. He's got his hand on his throat, and he's looking frightened. So it's just something that we really, really have to look at, because we are treating professionals. We're not policemen, and we don't work for the department, but we always have to be looking at treatment. In many of these situations, they don't require law enforcement. And that's really why our job is to teach the kids that we're working with what normal sexuality looks like and what appropriate sexuality is. And if you went back to that picture and tried to kind of fill in the blanks of what might be happening here, this does look like a forcing situation. However, if you are also looking at the entire picture, you might look at this boy who probably looks like he's maybe 16 and say, well, what happened to him? And why would he be doing that in these circumstances? And that's a very different mindset than those of you who hang around law enforcement. Law enforcement, that's not their job. Their job is to find the person that's doing something wrong and make sure that they stop. But our job is to go a little bit beyond that. And do we have time for this? Yeah, I'm going to show you this little video because one of the things that we have tried really hard not to do is to label our clients as sex offenders. However, we've made some progress on this in some states. This particular video is from Texas. And you know, some states are a little rougher about this than others.
I'm not a monster. I'm a person that made mistakes. I was a child, and I didn't even know what I was doing.
We all want to protect children. Listing juveniles on the public sex offender registry doesn't protect anyone. Putting their name and their faces and their address on the public registry devastates entire families.
We were playing with dolls, and the dolls were kissing, then we were kissing, and then it led to little fondling, you know, over the clothes, under the clothes. That was it, but obviously that was enough to convict. I was 12 and she was 8. I was during the summer, and I, you know, experimented and did some things that shouldn't have done, but that I didn't know. I didn't know the consequences. I thought something like this came with a grounding or a spanking. I was still that young. I've spent maybe close to 8 years behind bars.
Is that you?
That is me. I was young, right? When you hear sex offender, you don't think it's a 12-year-old little boy that's crying himself to sleep in a juvenile cell.
Most people think if you're on a registry, you're definitely dangerous. And so, but it's really, the real fact about it is that there's a broad range of offenses that can place a person, you know, especially a child, on the registry.
Who's your sons?
We all want to keep our children safe. The problem is that the laws are based on faulty assumptions. They're based on the assumption that children and adolescents who commit sex offenses are at high risk to commit more sex offenses. This isn't true. There are many studies, there's been over 30 that show low recidivism rates for youth who have sexually offended. That's the main point of registration and notification, is to reduce sexual recidivism. And that does not work.
I was a child. I was misunderstood. I did something wrong, yes. Punish me, and punish me appropriately. But don't throw me into a den of lions.
And I can understand paying some sort of price for doing something that wasn't right, but absolutely not have them put on the public registry and to have their names in all of the local newspapers and then expect them to go to school and mingle with the other kids.
The police will publish your information on the official website. In some states, they'll make mailers, they'll make flyers. Sometimes it's lawn signs saying sex offender lives here.
And all the neighbors were handed out pamphlets describing my sons in the house and where the sex offenders live. Vigilante groups coming to my house, the Molotov cocktail thrown at the house. The holes are still there around my bedroom window where the BBs went through the vinyl siding on the house. They were 11 and 13 years old. A person on the registry, even if it's a person that's 11 years old, 12 years old, 13 years old, cannot enter or live in zones that are frequented by children, meaning a park, a daycare, a nursery, a school.
I found it hard to, find a place to live. It's been difficult to keep jobs. I dropped out of college because of the registry. The registry also directly affects my own children, my wife. We have moved 9 different times in the past 3 years. They've been in 4 or 5 different schools. And that makes me feel like a horrible parent because I can't give my children what they need.
No matter how hard they're trying right now in their lives to get their lives together, it's never going to go away. You just Google up their names and up comes all the sex offender information. For what happened when they were 10 and 12 years old is turning out to be a life sentence.
This person has this label for the rest of their life based on something that they did when they were a child.
Juveniles should not be subjected to registration or notification. In the absence of any supportive evidence whatsoever that there's a community safety effect, youth should be protected from these laws.
you know, you can go on YouTube and find all kinds of this stuff. And some states are worse than others about this. But as therapists, I think we just have to always remember that these kids have been abused themselves. And if they act out sexually on other kids, it still remains a treatment issue for us. It's not our job to turn them over to law enforcement. Our job is to treat them. And I can't say it enough, just because I see it being so mishandled by other agencies. And what happens to especially boys, boys are much more apt to be vilified for this than girls are. Girls are always seen as victims in our society. Boys are not. So I think we have to be really careful. What I always try to tell, mostly we started out, this was for childcare workers, that what do you tell a child when you find out that they've done something like this? The child isn't bad, but what happened to them was very bad. And we as therapists, foster parents, adoptive parents have got to stay calm. And we've got to be supportive, because most kids who are doing some kind of sexual acting out think that they are damaged and think that they are bad. And they've usually gotten a lot of negative messages. The biggest, I think I started out with this, but the biggest group of people that this affects are adoptive parents, because adoptive parents are very, very often have not been subjected to anything like this. And they don't think that this can be cured, and they don't think that this can be fixed. And group homes across the state are full of failed adoptions. I can tell you that for certain sure, that once these kids get there, it's almost impossible for us as therapists to work with these adoptive parents to say, we can fix this. You can bring this child home. This can be okay. I'm thinking about a case that Shanice had a while back, where Shanice, I think you had
I was gonna say, yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't an adoptive case though, but it was a birth mom. But because she had been sexually abused as a child by a family member, she like overreacted by her children sexually exploring and doing stuff. And because she was triggered, it just was made worse. The situation was made worse.
And the boy was sent out of the home, right?
Yes.
And that was, Shanice didn't even have the boy. We ended up spending more time worrying about the boy who had been sent out of the home, and the mother was refusing to have the boy come back into the home, and the younger sibling missed him. So and loved him and wanted her brother back. So these cases are never simple. And if you don't get anything else out of this, there's nothing simple about this whole issue of childhood sexual abuse. It has a lot of different layers. Incest cases are different than the kids that are growing up in crack houses with a lot of adults who are doing things around them. Incest cases have a whole different layer of stuff that we have to deal with. The way kids show us what their reactions are is often very confusing and misleading. And that's why I have great respect for my therapists that are willing to do this work. This whole sexual trauma team that we have developed, I'm really proud of them. And I know that it's complex work. And I also know that sometimes, and I know this from my own work, that sometimes it's just really icky. It's I don't know how else to say it, but it's icky work. It's dealing with kids that have had things happen to them that they shouldn't have had happen to them. Their reactions are not getting a lot of sympathy from the people around them. Foster parents, adoptive parents, biological parents really often react really negatively to children who act out sexually. And then those kids feel like they're bad and damaged. And it's really hard to put some of those families back together. So we start with psychoeducation. This is what normal sexuality is. We start with it for the family, for the child that's acting out. And remember, a lot of these kids may not know the difference between normal sexuality and abnormal sexuality. because they haven't had the experience. So I believe okay, I'm going to unshare the screen. And I know that that's a lot. I know it's a lot of concepts that we're trying to explore, a lot of different layers to trying to work with some of these families, which is why we certainly don't mind if you call us and staff the cases with us. That's why we're here. But they're not easy cases, and you can't expect to not have some feelings yourself about the cases. It's like I said, when Shanice and I used to talk about that, we spent more time worrying about that 11-year-old boy that had been booted out of his house. We'd never even seen him. But it was just so clear that he was not going to come back, and they weren't going to let him back. And the sad thing is that nobody won in that situation. Nobody won. The younger sibling missed a brother. The brother felt like he was forever ostracized, and the mother lost her child. So if we can't get in there and intervene effectively and help people to all understand that anything can be fixed, anything can be fixed if you get it early enough in the game. The difficulty that we have found, especially with the adoption cases, is that if you get it too late, it's really hard to turn it around at that point. Now, I want to make sure that I have everybody. I think I've got everybody accounted for. Okay, does anybody have any comments that you would like to add to this? Clients that you've had, similar circumstances? LaJean?
When you say to be aware of your own biases as a therapist, that is so true. You know, the case that I had, I did not want to work with a young man who had molested another child, and being given the case and you guys talking me through it. It really did open my eyes. I was able to see this young man as a victim as well. And so coming as a therapist, my mind was like, oh my God, I don't want to work with this kid. He's done this to another kid. To changing and say, wow, he is a victim, and being able to help him to redirect, to, you know, have his own safety plan. And also to deal with some of that negative attitude that he has gotten from his adoptive parents. They have all but they really have abandoned him and pushed him off to his grandparents. But to make sure that his self-esteem is still there, he's participating in positive social activities, that he's thriving in the midst of this situation. Just to hear that young man in the video was 12 years old, and he did something he wasn't supposed to, and it was like a life sentence. That could have very easily been my client.
Yeah.
And so, just really be aware of your biases, but know also too, the skill set that you have can be a game changer, be a lifesaver. So.
Well, thank you for that. LaShawn is pretty fearless about taking difficult cases, and we appreciate that.
So I have a couple of questions.
ahead,
Maybe
Steve.
Barbara, you would know, but is there any statistics on whether male or female children get abused or more, or is it about equal?
No, statistically, there are more boys being molested than you might think, but girls are still molested more than boys. I think when we first started studying this issue, we didn't think that little boys went through any kind of abuse. But now we know that they do. So, and probably in far greater numbers than we thought.
And then the other thing I was gonna say is that another thought of mine is that a lot of the abuse that's happened over time when it comes to like for children and like in older generations, I wonder if a lot of that has to do with the fact that just being homosexual was not allowed, like in society, like it was frowned upon. And maybe what some homosexual people did, I don't know if there's any truth to this, is they abused children because those were people that it was safe to kind of do these things with. So they didn't have the fear of like, being punished by society.
Well, let me just say one thing about that whole issue. You realize that homosexuality was outlawed in Great Britain until the 70s. I mean, this isn't ancient history. And we know that we've gone through all kinds of iterations of accepting different versions of sexuality. But one of
I mean, that's why I bring it up, because maybe that's where it comes from. It comes from that past of like the fact that homosexuality was in a lot of ways legally it was illegal. And so maybe that's why the kids became the target. And now it's done this thing to where for generations, now we're stuck in this pattern of, kids being abused, but maybe that's the origin of all of that.
Well, and that's
Wouldn't that be stereotyping though?
Somebody said something?
And wouldn't that be stereotyping though? Like saying that it's like the homosexuality, that they're abusing children. If I'm understanding what Stephen said.
I'm just trying to figure out who's talking.
It's Deanna Halliday.
Oh, okay. Well, I think we have to be careful that
I'm sure there's exceptions to the rule, but maybe this happened for some people.
I think you have to be careful about saying that people that are homosexual are also child abusers.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm talking about previous generations where like people who were homosexual, they couldn't have sexual relations because, society didn't allow them.
Right. I would not know how to comment on that. I think the part of the problem somebody said something. Deanna?
I would have to disagree with the homosexuality having anything to do with abusing children. I think that it's separate.
Yeah, it probably is. We get into the whole thing about the Catholic priests molesting the children and all of that. I mean, none of this is easy to understand, but we have to not confuse somebody's sexuality with their willingness or eagerness or acceptance of having sex with children. We live in a very complex society, and with all of the different sexual choices that people have now, we have to be careful about stereotyping. So I guess that's probably all I can say about that. But anybody else have anything that they want to add?
I do. It's Deanna again. I was working with a child that was exhibiting behaviors, and then it was found that uncle and aunt in the family were abusing their children, and all the children were removed from the home. And this was after the case had been, after the sessions were complete. And then this child was removed from the home as well. And it was found that he was a part of it with the uncle. They were exploiting the children. And I had always wondered, but was never left alone with him in therapy, for him to come out and tell me.
Right.
So in those situations, when a child and you've done everything and you've worked from every angle, and they feel like they can't tell because the parents, they're afraid to tell. So what else is there to do?
Well, I would just say, Deanna, that there's reasons that this is a tough profession. And there are kids that are never going to share those secrets. Those secrets are ingrained in them. And when you have family and intergenerational family stuff, this can go back a long way. They are used to living like this. They're used to keeping these secrets. It's like growing up in an alcoholic household. You're used to keeping secrets. And that's why this is such a difficult field. We have all had cases, I'm sure, where we have looked at this kid and said, I know something is happening here. And yet you can't get them to tell you. You saw those two young men on the Michael Jackson thing saying, I just wasn't ready. I wasn't ready until now. So, and some people are never ready. Okay, Carol, do you have anything to add?
Just a couple of things had crossed my mind as we were going through all of this, and one goes back to, celebrity status and what does that look like? How did those children grow up? And I just recently heard with like Drew Barrymore and Brooke Shields. I don't know if anybody else had heard that Drew Barrymore's mother encouraged her to date people because then the mother dated those boys or young men. And so that was one of the things that really she felt was abusive. That's a child abuse and in a different level. And the other one was Brooke. Her mom wouldn't allow her to do anything with anyone because her mom was, she says, in love with her because she didn't want her to be loved by anyone else. So, there's so many different forms of child abuse and they live with those things, just like you said. They don't think anything is abnormal about it because that's what they're used to and groomed in a sense by a parent. So that's one of the things. The other thing that came to my mind is when the two gentlemen were talking about Michael Jackson and they said, well, that they're just not ready. And I totally can agree with that because, you can start talking with the client. And I've always told my people that I've worked with, I'm not going to be the main and only person, the therapist in your life. So as things, continue to move on, and I've told the caregivers too, they'll need someone else because they'll be ready to say more things and may not divulge all of that until they're well into their 20s.
Yeah, you're right. But what you do is still very important because what you do as a therapist along the way, the messages that you give them, the acceptance that you give them is incredibly important. And maybe they don't tell you anything, but maybe they go on to the next person and maybe they do because you have been kind and accepting and willing to let them talk. And maybe they just didn't want to tell you. I have had people like the kid I saw on day on campus who I would see them years later and they would say, I wanted to tell you, but I didn't want you to think badly of me. I didn't want you to think that I was that kind of a person, or I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want you to be mad at me. And then you think, oh, what was I doing that made that child think that I was going to be mad at her if she told me this? So if you're always kind and you're always open and you're always accepting, you might not get the story, but maybe the story will come. And I think we have to kind of leave it at that.
And I think too, what you said, Barbara, that you might be mad at them, and maybe they did tell you some things that you didn't think, wasn't anything big, but to them it was a big deal. And it could be just something very simple, and that it was just kind of gnawing at them. So you don't know what all the things that they told you and how hard it may have been to already say that. So they're really just building their confidence level up,
right,
to be able to trust whomever is the right person at the right time. So I totally agree. Everything we do with them, with our clients, whether you feel you got what you wanted, it's not about you. It's about the client and making sure that we help them to the best that we can.
Yep, I totally agree. And on that very positive note, I'm going to let you all go. I will be doing, for those of you who need CEUs, I'll be probably doing those tomorrow morning. And for those of you, for our guests, and I neglected to welcome our guests, but let me do it now at the very end. We're always happy to have people come, have Amanda Dumas back and join us again. And if you all need
Can you hear me? Yes. hear you. Yeah, so I'm Zoe Solero. I am Shane's juvenile probation officer.
I can hear somebody talking, but I don't know what they're saying. Anyway, for those of you who are guests, if you need training certificates, I will email them to you tomorrow morning. Amanda, it was always good to see you again. And it's always, I'm really happy that you guys all came, because I think this is a very complicated subject and you have been pretty fearless embracing it for Circle of Friends. So I appreciate that.
Barbara, could I also have one of those training certificates?
Sure. No problem. All right. I hope you all have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Barbara.
Yeah.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take it easy.